Hello, Power Shift. How is that? How is that? I'd like you to know, while I was back there, I just got a text message from an advisor to the Prime Minister, who will remain unnamed, saying, "WTF, mate? Very impressive." He could have been talking about the photos I posted on Facebook last night, but I'm pretty sure he was talking about you. So I'm here to talk to you about the power of this room in this federal election. I'm going to take you through the simple logic of how elections work and who will decide this election. Let me tell you a little bit about GetUp first and where we're coming from. So, are there any GetUp members in the room? Yes, okay. Well, GetUp, there are 600,000 of you across the country. People have taken action through GetUp over the years. 100,000 of them have donated. Together, we stand for a more progressive Australia. One with social justice, economic fairness, and of course, environmental sustainability at its core. And we don't just, stand for it and argue with our friends. We get together online for really, really effective action. From signing the biggest petitions Australia has ever seen, to chipping in together to raise millions of dollars to run ads on TV and radio and in national newspapers, to working with our friends in the climate movement for the biggest rallies on climate change that this country's ever seen. And the power that GetUp members have shown over the last 7 years really is a testament to the role that young people play in elections. I'm going to walk you through how this election is going to work. There's a very simple logic to this election. And I want to tell you a story about the very, very quiet revolution that happens in Australian elections. Nobody understands this. Probably nobody has explained it to you in the media. But there's one group in Australia who has determined the last 4 federal elections in a row. It's demonstrable. And it's not the Business Council, right? It's not the Chamber of Commerce. It's not even the ACTU. There's one group, and it's young people in Australia. And I'm going to take you through the logic of how young people in Australia change elections and why everybody in this room can change this climate election. There are 3 things I want to explain. I'm going to tell you what they are now, and then I'm going to prove each of them, and I'll come back. First is that this is the critical election in the critical decade for climate change. The second is that young people will decide that election. And the third is that as young people, we have the most power, because young people listen most to other young people. So let's go through these one by one. This is the critical election in the critical decade for climate change in Australia. We know this is the critical decade for climate action here because this is when we have to stop our emissions rising and start them falling. This is when we have to set up our infrastructure so we can change our economy from dirty, polluting power that is making us sick to clean, renewable energy. And what the government does really does matter, as today proves. And as the last year has proved. Because in the last year, since we put a renewable energy target in and a price on pollution, we've seen emissions from coal go down 7.7%. Wow! Do you have any more of those coming? Should I wait? In the last year, since we introduced a price on pollution and a renewable energy target, we've seen emissions from power generation go down 7.7%. And we've seen renewable energy go up by 23%. What governments do matter, like heaps. So what's at stake this time? What's at stake this election? Well, firstly, there's coal. Australia has enough coal in the ground that if we export it and put it in the air, that's 1/12 of all of the pollution that the whole world can put into the air if we're going to survive a reasonable level of climate change, 2 degrees. If we export all of our coal and put it in the air, that's 1/12 of the entire amount of pollution the world has allowed, just from Australia. Now, if Tony Abbott wins this election, he's going to get rid of the Environmental Protection Act, which will make it a hell of a lot easier to export that coal through the middle of the Great Barrier Reef. If Tony Abbott wins this election, we'll go from a government whose rhetoric on climate change is that it's the greatest moral, social and economic challenge of our generation, to a government whose rhetoric on climate change is that it's absolute crap. The other thing that's at stake this election is the Senate. The The Senate, of course, is the House of Review for Australian Parliament. It's a house that reviews every piece of legislation that the Prime Minister passes. And they can decide whether it goes into law or not. At the moment, the Senate is controlled by the Greens, who have fought really hard for a price on pollution and for strong renewable energy targets. Good for them. After this election, there's a very real risk that the Senate won't be controlled by the Greens anymore. It'll rather be controlled by somebody you may not have heard of. His name is Senator Madigan. He's from right here in Victoria. Senator Madigan does not believe in human-caused climate change. He's part of the 7% who don't. And in fact, he used his position in the Senate this year to pass a bill against wind power. He could have a deciding vote on every piece of legislation that goes through the Australian Parliament for the next 3.5 years. Those are the stakes. So this is the critical election for the critical decade of climate change. What happens matters, it matters a lot. But young people will decide the outcome. Here's why. This is how elections work, in a very simple way. Basically, you've got about 40% of Australians always vote left. About 9% vote Greens and about 30% vote Labor, and they do so pretty much every election. They're the people you see on the right over here, on your left. I'm glad I got that right. The left people are on the left. They're very consistent. They're largely older people, they don't change their vote very often, and they consistently vote for the left. On the other hand, on the right, you've got about 40% of the population who always vote for the right. They vote for the Liberals or the Nationals, they might vote for Katter this time, or they might vote for Clive Palmer's party. God help them. But they're voting for some variation of right-wing parties, and they're doing so consistently. In the middle, you've got two groups here, the purple and the orange groups. They're the groups I want to tell you about. Most people only have one group in there because they only talk about swinging voters. People who are undecided, they change their vote between election to election, and they decide who really wins. They're about 10, 15% of the population, depending on the election. But the other group that's up there is people who don't vote at all, but could. And that's about 1.4 million Australians at the last election. That's 10% of all the people who are eligible to vote. So you've got two groups in the middle there who actually decide how elections are decided, right? People who are undecided about whom to vote for, and people who are undecided about whether to vote. So who are these people who decide elections? Who are the people who aren't voting? It's young people. In fact, there are 500,000, 493,000 Australians who are not enrolled to vote at the next federal election. 500,000 of them. And mobilising those people and getting them out to vote can have an incredible impact on elections. And I want to tell you a story about how. Now, I started at GetUp when I was 18 as an intern and a volunteer. And one of the first things I did was write a little paper, and we submitted it to the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters. It's a very boring, dry committee, and there was kind of surprise that this 18-year-old rocked up to give them a submission. And in fact, when I told them my age, one of the senators on the committee laughed in the middle of the hearing. 5 years later, I was still at GetUp, and we ran a High Court case that had his laws that I was talking about in the committee declared unconstitutional. So I guess I had the last laugh. You bastard. What we did at the last election was very simple. There were over 100,000 Australians who tried to enrol to vote. They sent in their enrolment forms after the election was called, which is a very logical time to send in an enrolment form. But the coalition government had very sneakily changed the deadline, so you only had 1 day to send in your enrolment forms. And you had to send it in by post or by fax. They didn't see the problem with fax machines. They're like, yeah, young people can enroll, let us fax it through to us. And so there were 100,000 people who were trying to enrol to vote, and they were being disqualified because of a very insidious change. And we ran a High Court case that called that unconstitutional, and we won. The number of people who were able to vote because of that case were 100,000. They're the orange people you see up there. The number of people who were the difference between the major parties at the last election, they're the blue people there. Enrollment changes elections. Who is voting changes elections. And that court case meant that young people who were trying to enroll to vote but being shut out of the system decided the election. Here's what it looked like in marginal seats. Here are 6 of the most marginal seats last election. It was decided by 1 marginal seat, by the way. The orange column is the people who enrolled through our court case. The blue column was the margin between the 2 parties. Enrollment changes elections. This time you don't have to run a court case to enroll people to vote, because now they have 7 days, and now you can enroll to vote online, which means that all of your friends and peers and university colleagues and your cousins who you haven't talked to in a while but you think maybe they're not on the roll like mine, you can ring them all up and tell them that they need to get on the roll and they can change this election. And they can do so in 30 seconds online. There are 1,000 of us in the room. If each of us enrolled 10, 20 people, we would have enrolled more than the difference between the major parties at the last election. Enrollment can change elections, and the people in this room can do it. Once again, I just want to repeat, there are 500,000 young Australians who are not on the roll and are not voting this election. The difference between the major parties last election, 15,000. So that's the first group, people who aren't decided about whether to vote. The second group is people who aren't decided how they're going to vote. Who are these people? Who are the swinging voters that decide elections? Well, there was a very big study done by the Whitlam Institute at University of Western Sydney. It's like this much. I'll show you some of the graphs in a second. The conclusion after all this study was that younger voters were consistently at the extremes in terms of their frequency and scale of varying voter intentions. As a group, they're not so much swinging voters, but in a state of constant electoral motion. Add to that the fact that the older voters almost always vote the same way, and you can get the picture. Younger voters constitute the swinging voters who are under 25 are 4% of the electorate. The difference between the major parties is less than 1%. Now, how do we know this? Because the Whitlam Institute wrote this massive long paper, and I'm not going to, I just want you to know that they took it pretty seriously. Here are some of the graphs that they included. I understood all of those. But the one paragraph of the report that you do need to read is this sentence. A conservative reading of news poll data indicates that the youth vote had a substantial, possibly determinative impact on the outcomes of the last 4 federal elections. That's what the graphs meant. So, young people will decide this election result, as they have decided the last 4 election results in a row. They'll do it because they're the biggest group of swinging voters in the country. They'll do it because if they enroll to vote, they completely change the way that this electorate looks. The next thing you need to understand is that young people really only listen to other young people. The Australian Institute recently did a study of young Australians to ask them what influenced their vote. And here's what they said. They said having a positive meeting with their MP, like literally running into Kevin Rudd on the street and him seeming like a good bloke. 18% of them said that would have an influence on how they voted. So 80% of them said they could meet their MP in person and it wouldn't make a difference to how they voted. 34% of them said that the media would influence how they vote. 20% said that advertising from the parties would influence how they vote. And over 70% said that the most important thing in influencing their vote was their friends. Makes sense, right? Because young people are not reading newspapers every day. We're not watching the TV shows where Kevin Rudd is running his advertisements. And we don't really care. The thing we care about is what do our friends think? What do our peers think? What do they tell us about the election? It's the most important factor in how we vote and whether we vote. So the cumulative total of all these facts is this. This is the critical election for the critical decade of Australia's response to climate change. Young people will decide the election by changing their vote or by deciding to vote when they wouldn't have. And the only people in the country they really listen to are their friends. Now, that leads me to think that if you had a large group of young people, say, who cared about the election and were willing to work together to talk to their friends, convince them that they should vote, and that they should vote for people who take climate change seriously, you could have a pretty serious impact on the election. That's my fourth point. There is nobody else. This is the largest gathering of young Australians working the election in the country. It may be the largest gathering of young Australians working on an election ever, at least since Gough Whitlam. There is nobody else in the country who is in a position to do this. There is nobody else in the country who has brought together 1,200 young people who are ready to dedicate their lives for the next couple of months to working on the election. There is nobody else. The people in this room are the best positioned in the country to change this election that is so crucial for how Australia deals with climate change. It's simple logic. The people in this room can change the election. The last page of the report, that big fat report with all the graphs, had some reviews from journalists, and one of them said this: disenchanted as they may be, young people may not realise just how significant their votes have been. This analysis leaves you wondering just how potent a political force they may be if they chose to mobilise. If they chose to mobilise. So my message is very, very simple. Don't wonder. Don't leave them wondering what would happen if young people chose to mobilise. Let's do it. Now I'm going to walk off the stage in a minute, and Kirsty and Lucy are going to come on and outline AYCC's election strategy. Now downstairs, there's a little green room downstairs where you get prepared and have some water before you come on. The downstairs is like directly below here, and it's kind of hard to hear. And I know that they're a bit worried because they've put all this thought into an election strategy and they're not sure whether the people in the room are actually fired up about it. They don't know whether they're going to have anybody to implement their strategy and whether they can actually go ahead and make the changes that they've outlined in their pitch. So before they come up, I want to make sure that they're not nervous anymore. We're going to have to be pretty loud if they're going to hear us downstairs, but I want them to know that you're all really excited about the election. So, can we make some noise for Kirsty and Lucy in 1 second? I think you know what to do. If I say power. Yeah? If I say power, you say... Oh! If I say power, you say... Power! 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 Let's make this a climate election. Let's make this a youth election. Let's make this a youth climate election. Please welcome Kirsty and Lucy as they come up to tell you how to do it.